Good. It's 5 past the hour, and with all respect for the people who are here in time, I'd love to start this meeting. Uh, Much to my surprise, there's only two uh, participants rather than the 20 that registered. The good news is that these two probably are excellent participants to engage in the debate on how to progress best our thinking about spectrum issues in the light of EU-US ICT development collaboration. Online we have APRE, who has been organizing the webinar and facilities, and who will explain a little bit more about how this works. We have Christian Sontag as presenter, who is representing the IoT CPS stakeholder group. We have Jonathan Cave, who is the main author of the document, who will introduce the document and the topics, and also expand a little bit on the big data aspects of it. We have Yanning Zhu, who speaks on behalf of the 5G networks expert groups. My name is Maarten Botterman. I have the honor and pleasure of chairing the policy expert group of the PICASSO team. So, having only 3 participants, I would like to invite you to introduce yourself shortly before we go into the webinar. So, Francisco, as you're on top, would you be willing to present yourself shortly?
Maybe Francisco, you don't have the speakers. If you want to, oh, Francisco has just. If you want to type, the icon of the microphone has to be green.
There is a microphone because it's not green and it's not.
Okay, I think now I've got it. Can you hear me?
Yes. Well, thank you.
I'm an ex-European Commission official. Now I'm running my own consultancy, and that's in this capacity that I'm participating in this webinar. Thank you.
I'm sorry, Francisco, I hear you a little bit low, so maybe you can adjust your microphone volume within the arrow that is going down near the the microphone.
Is it
you
better?
Can just, yes, better. Thank you.
Okay. Shall I speak again?
Yes, thanks.
All right. I'm an ex-European Commission official, but now I have left the Commission and I'm running my own consultancy business, and it is in that capacity that I am participating on this webinar. Thank you.
Thank you. So maybe we can.
I see that Gordon is typing.
Yes. Maybe we can ask Gordon to present himself. Now you should see the microphone icon. Can you hear us, Martin or Gordon? Can you hear me?
Oh, right. Gordon says that he can't see the microphone icon, but Martin and Jonathan both know him, which is quite true. Welcome, Gordon.
Okay, and we have also Alvaro Oliveira. We had Alvaro? No, I'm sorry. Yes. You now should see the microphone volume and the microphone icon. I will just skip this slide to let you understand where are they. So now you should see it, and it has to be green if you want to talk. I cannot hear pretty well. Maybe Alvaro could type in the case. No, unfortunately.
Maybe we should just kick off, I'm thinking, because it may be that some people don't have microphones enabled or have a software problem, because some people drop on and off. So Alvaro, for example, whom we also know is now disconnected. So we have Francisco, Gordon, and Vim.
Maybe, Jonathan, while I'm fixing the problem of Martin, you can show the agenda.
Okay, right. Okay, so this is the agenda. We'll go on for as long as the discussion lasts. We've each tried to be relatively brief in the slides we've put together. And basically, they're based on the document which many of you will have seen. We're going to start with a welcome. Well, we've sort of had a welcome. Martin may wish to say a bit more if he's able to speak again. Then I'll talk about the general aspects of spectrum policy issues as they relate to, well, ICT development, but also in particular research and innovation collaboration between the US and the EU, because there are not just spectrum policies in the two areas, but also some areas of joint interest, either technologies that affect policy or policies that affect technology. And then we'll get some perspectives from each of the three technological domains on which the project has been focusing, with Yanning talking from the 5G perspective, myself giving a few remarks on the big data aspects of this. I'm described there as deputizing. That's deputizing for the big data expert group. And Christian representing RTCPS. And then we'll have a discussion. We'll have discussion after my bit and discussion after the specific technology bits, probably after all three of them. And then I'll present some very modest preliminary conclusions, in part because spectrum policy has certain things that make it not quite as prone to sweeping policy statements as perhaps the others were. Okay, so that's the agenda. Now, Martin, oh, I see. Martin's going to log in by phone. So I will attempt to make the slides move, if I can make the slides move. Oh, yes, there they go. Oh, I've got a control too, don't I? Yes. Okay, so the PICASSO project, most of the people listening will know something about it. It's a CSA that runs until the end of June this year. It is addressed to industry, government, and civil society actors, particularly on research and innovation in the ICT domains and policy coordination, particularly between the EU and the US. And the idea is that collaboration around research and innovation not only helps to accelerate and make more useful research and innovation, in part because we have common technologies and common standards, and because we have policy frameworks that can react to the standards and technologies that each side is likely to produce, but also because the pattern of development in relation to these three particular technology domains has been slightly uneven on both sides of the Atlantic, in the sense that in one side, the technology may be more developed and the application more developed on the other, or because certain elements of policy, for example, privacy policy or aspects of trade policy, may affect the balance of what are, after all, global technologies. So that's the underlying motivation. The priorities of PICASSO are the priorities of the EU policy development, or at least were at the beginning of the project. And in particular, they're connected with digital single market developments and things like Industry 4.0. It's not moved on to 4.5. And the specific technology clusters that we are focused on are 5G, the Internet of Things and cyber physical systems, and data analytics or big data or big data and artificial general intelligence. And we're looking at the synergies between, particularly in this collection of people, between policies and technologies to reinforce collaboration in pre-competitive research and innovation, knowing that ultimately European and US firms will engage in the market either as competitors or as, let's say, complements within value chains. And in particular, it's focused on the ones that seem to have the biggest promise or where the marginal contribution of collaboration will be greatest in meeting common societal challenges. And because these technologies are very important to the critical elements of policy dialogue, by which I mean those that are the subject of things like the Privacy Shield or subject of trade negotiations and so on, we have had a series of policy-orientated, what would you call them, thematic papers that try to set the general questions, look at the scope for interaction between the EU and the US, and then pull out those specific elements referring to the particular technologies about which we've thought. And two of them, privacy and security, are mentioned here because they were active policy debates. Well, they remain an active policy debate. There's another, internet governance, which has sort of lifted itself up above the levels of national or EU government, but remains of keen interest to both of them. And there are certain aspects like interoperability and the emergent role of ethical principles that keep coming up time and time again. And even though they may not yet have been the subject of explicit government policy, they're implicit in it. So the structure of the project as a whole is three technologically orientated expert groups and one policy expert group. You can see the names of them there, and there's not much to say about this that I haven't already said, except to say that attached to each of these expert groups are a series of experts, some overlapping. There are about 25 of them, well, slightly more than 25 in total across all the groups. And yeah, so that's the overall structure. Okay, we've been through that. Hopefully this is sort of working. And
yes, just
yeah.
for Jonathan, I will just try to explain to the other how to participate. Now you can see that it has been enabled only the volume of the system, but if you raise your hand or you just type, you will see. Oh, I'm sorry, I cannot see anymore the slide. You will see the microphone icon here, and I will enable you to talk. Okay, thank you. I think that Martin can talk now, so I'm
Good.
trying
I'll shut
to.
up and let Mark.
Well, thank you.
Yes.
For sure, sorry for the connection problems. I'm now talking via my telephone, whereas I'm looking at the screen of my PC. So again, welcome everybody, and thanks for that introduction, Jonathan. Perfect, as always. Just to scope the issue for this one, the next slide, and it's really, can I have the next slide, please? The thing is, for spectrum issues, I think the understanding that we have is issues have fundamentally changed. And the hypothesis for this webinar is in a way what you find as our draft final conclusion, that research collaboration should mainly focus on common challenges. And it's important to identify ways to find solutions that work for the US and EU, and for that matter, are more likely to work robustly around the world. So in a way to put in critical mass that matters. And also to support specifically joint research that exploits technologies to resolve common problems. There's problems we do share. We do believe that the possibilities and implications of the agility in the spectrum allocation is maybe the most promising research area. By more intelligent use, more becomes possible. At the same time, we are aware of the need for people to know there's some consistency in how these policies roll out. With that, Jonathan, back to you, requesting you to introduce the paper. And please, because the group is this small, do feel free to raise your hand in between, and Marta will give you the microphone at that point. Okay, that will work, right?
Okay. Yep. Okay. Yes. Thank you, Martin. And yes, I can see your hand up, so that thing is actually working. Right. Well, let me just pop on to the next slide. So basically, all of the technological domains that all three of our technological domains require connectivity between devices to create networks through which information flows and activities are coordinated. As part of this connectivity, as part of the set of connectivities on which they rely, radio is particularly important, not least because many of the users and uses thrive on ubiquity. In other words, they expect pretty much the same types of services and the same levels of service quality and functionality, no matter where they are, and even if they are moving from place to place. So we could call that ubiquitous connectivity, but more than that, even a lot of the fixed line connectivity, the things that you get when you're in your home environment or in a static within an institutional space, will come about wirelessly, will be provided wirelessly, in part because it's just more efficient. And I'm speaking to you from the UK, where we don't seem to be able to get broadband to work across large chunks of the country, including the one where I live. I'm half a mile out of town, and to get any sort of decent broadband speed, I have to use 4G, because even when I get fiber, it's fiber to the cabinet, and it goes through lots and lots of copper, and it basically doesn't work. So a lot of this is wireless, in part because you can provide it with much lower capital investment, and it's easier and cheaper to maintain. When lightning strikes, it doesn't boil off the copper in the underground wires or break the fibers. It's easy to extend because you don't need to interconnect with switches and things like that, which is why we can't put up community fiber, by the way. And it's very easy to update, which is going to be of particular importance as we move forward. That means that a lot of the developments in terms of connectivity can be understood in this sort of generic sense. We want, cheap, extensible, robust types of networking. But there are particular implications for the three technologies that we'll be talking about. But there are also specific implications for some of the derived areas of application. And I'll just mention a couple here, M2M communications, broadcast types of content distribution, cloud computing or grid computing or fog computing or what have you, provision of different types of internet and mobile access, and smart environments, including things like smart cities. All of these, for one reason or another, have connectivity requirements that can be served by wireless communications, and in some cases must, for economic or technical reasons, be served by them. Now, all of this means that there has been already, and will increasingly be, a demand for wireless connectivity. Now, there are kind of three dimensions of that connectivity. One is the frequency band in which you are operating. Another one is the power that you're using. And a third is the geographical location. A fourth one, which is sort of latent, is the protocol that's being used to communicate. Now, all of these things, if put together in the wrong ways, create interference, which is a problem, and more of a problem for some uses than others. But to a certain extent, we can meet the increased demand for frequencies and for bandwidth simply by moving up to higher frequencies. Like, for example, the automobiles that automatically call the emergency services using the 40 gigahertz band, which is only just beginning to be allocated and used. But we can also do things that make more efficient use of existing bands, because most of the time, most of the spectrum that we have is not being used. And there are various modalities of allocation that can allow us to get more out of that capacity, the same as we do with any other sort of network provision. And if this is seamless enough, ubiquitous enough, performs well enough, and so on, it will give users the impression that whatever connectivity they need will be available to them. And that infinite bandwidth doesn't only mean that they can do the things that they set out to do perfectly well, but it also means that innovative things, which start out with a fairly large footprint where you need, for example, to spill over around your particular allocation, these innovations can also work particularly well. So what I'm going to talk about is, first of all, a little bit about the generic aspects of spectrum policy, what's baked into the framework that might need to change or has specific implications. And then I'll frame a couple of preliminary issues. One is the need to adapt our current allocation and management techniques to cope with technological developments. The second is to adjust the research programs to deal with the issues that come out of spectrum policy. So it's the first bullet turned on its head. And then finally, particularly for research and innovation, collaborative research and innovation, which requires data sharing, model sharing, and all those kinds of things, to ensure that along with all the other competing uses of spectrum, some commercial, some government, some emergency services, and so on, that scientific purposes get their spectral needs met. Then we'll have a bit of discussion. We'll then talk about the specific domains. We'll come back to talk about policy. So, first, allocation mechanisms. Traditionally, there's been a mix of two kind of extreme forms of allocation mechanisms. The first is long-term exclusive rights, these sort of 30-year spectrum licenses that get allocated through auctions, which basically says that there's one user, and the user or the owner of that spectrum can do whatever they like with it. And then there are also unlicensed bands or unlicensed use of spectrum, which may be low power, for example, or very localized, or undeveloped bands like the very high frequency bands, where anybody can come in and they can do certain things, but not everything. These basic mechanisms have been tweaked as the use of spectrum and our ability to use it has evolved. One thing is, for example, if you hand out a 30-year license, you create a sort of local monopoly. And that may frustrate innovation. So if somebody comes along with a new and better use of that spectrum, they won't necessarily be able to bring it to the market or put it in the airwaves. If you make the spectrum licenses resellable, then even within that 30-year frame, you can have them gravitate to more productive uses. And that also strengthens the incentives to innovate, but at the same time retaining this 30-year space within which you can develop things that may not pay back for a certain period of time. But along the way, in order to make that work, it's been necessary to modify some of the license forms. So if I have a big block of license and I'm doing WiMAX, for example, and you want to use a chunk of spectrum near me for doing LTE, there will be interference between our two uses. And so we need to have some mechanism for managing that interference. So I can get the full bandwidth, but if I chop it in half, we then need to put guard bands in to stop interference. And so in between different protocols or different license forms like the European SUL or Spectrum Utilization License, we try to make the fixed allocation thing work a little better. And there are also things to fix the thing about people who monopolize the spectrum and create losses that way. One is a kind of use it or lose it provision, which says that, yes, it's your spectrum, but if you're not using it, it becomes available to others through an easement or through loss of license. And in particular, with things like television white space, there are rules in more than a few countries that say that if I own spectrum, I have an obligation in real time to make utilization information available so that people can pick it up and either buy it from me or use it. But the future probably lies with DSA, or dynamic spectrum access. And there's a little diagram there that shows different kinds of approaches. In particular, a dynamic version of the exclusive use model, which I talked about, an open sharing model where spectrum is a commons, and within certain ground rules, anybody can use it, or a hierarchical access model that sets, let's say, a large allocation within which you can negotiate conditional access and may protect certain uses, like, for example, preemptive use for emergency services. And connected with that are mechanisms in the bottom row that might be developed or modified, including different forms of spectrum property right, controlling what I can do with spectrum, what I can expect to earn from it, DSA mechanisms, so I may be able to have use of spectrum conditional on participating in a DSA. There may be things like underlay and overlay as well, which are ways of putting signal through the parts or through the frequency bandwidth in ways that don't interfere with what other people do. Okay, now there are kind of four styles of spectrum policy that exist. One is a prohibition style, in which you ban certain access or use of spectral resources by particular users, uses, or technologies, with the default being that you allow them under common framework conditions. So this is a kind of ex-ante regulation or permissive or approval type regulation. The flip side of that is a permission mechanism which is like what happens with the auctioned off licenses. So particular users, or technologies are allowed to use the spectrum, but if they're not permitted to do it, then they can't do it. Then mediating between the two is a system of tradable spectrum rights, or tradable access rights, or tradable use rights. And to complement that trade, which is a sort of open market, particularly because some uses of spectrum are used to deliver other vertical types of service, there may be negotiations or bargains or contracts between, on the one hand, people who can give access to spectral resources and those who might need to use them. And these mechanisms that have evolved may need to be rebalanced or configured. Now, if we do change these spectrum policies, there is both an immediate and a sort of longer term effect. The immediate effect is to help us work out. So part of this has to do with what a market should do. What a market should do is to say, this is where these resources should be used. These are the best uses of those resources. Then, having identified them, it should channel the resources to their best uses and make sure that the costs of using them are adequately paid for. And so competitive markets, if you could have them, do all of those things. And what we would like is that the spectrum policies should help us to identify and implement efficient use of spectral resources. Now, an example of how they don't would be if, for example, I have a particular technology in mind, let's say WiMAX, and I buy up a bunch of spectrum licenses, and you have another one, let's say LTE or paired spectrum use, that turns out to be better at delivering the things that that I'm going to deliver, which may be, for example, just simple browsing access or streaming or role-playing games. Now, if I own the license, you can't have it. And the fact that you could have paid more for it had you developed the technology at the time the auction was held is sort of neither here nor there. So we won't even know that your better thing exists because nobody will invest in your research because they know that you won't be able to get access to the market. So there are problems of kind of market failure, and we would like to fix the policies in such ways to overcome them. And the other thing is that we want the spectrum to be used by or to go to the best users of that spectrum. So that's not the use of the spectral resources. That is, should I be using it for playing games or linking up IoT things or doing 5G things or channeling sensor data to a big data center for analytics? So we have to make sure that there isn't distortion up and downstream of the market, sort of a spectrum version of net neutrality. In the long term, the fact that you have policies that are capable of doing those things should provide incentives to develop better ways of doing things, which is new technologies, new services, but also new forms of business model, in which spectrum becomes kind of a linchpin that ties these extended enterprises together. It may also change market structures. So if we, for example, use spectrum to bypass fixed line monopolies, then that's certainly going to get the big telcos out of this central position they operate in many countries with regard to the internet. Because the internet is really nothing to do with copper wires or with telephone companies or their switches. It's just that they happen to own the pipe through which all those things flowed. And therefore, they not only have market power, they have policy power as well. So you can imagine that if things open up, those structures will also change. And moreover, they should affect any value chain that has a wireless link. So it may be something that isn't obviously a matter of wireless ICT or radio, like, for example, smart transport or e-health or things like that. They'll also be affected in slightly longer run. Now, that's the sort of first one, which is making the policies respond to the technologies. Second one is research into wireless technologies and service. And here the point is that the price and availability of access will determine what technologies get developed and what technologies get deployed. And there'll be changes associated with these technological domains that the others will speak to more directly. But I just wanted to mention there'll be new types of users who will have new demands for spectrum. In particular, they may have different requirements for connection continuity, quality, privacy, security, and so on. And there are also variations within them. So, for example, mobile users or autonomous vehicles or IoT devices and so on will have different requirements for spectrum and spectrum continuity. So in the case of the person mown down by the self-driving car in Arizona, that's kind of a latency matter. Yes, there was a driver in the car, but the driver wasn't paying attention. A system could have paid attention, but it had 1.4 seconds between the time the person was visible and the time the person was killed. That under some circumstances would be enough time, under other circumstances not. There are also different uses which have different access technologies and management technologies. many of which are legacy technologies, but many of which will not be superseded by a single common one, but will have to remain somewhat different. They'll also have varying time patterns and frequency needs and so on. And they may work better with exclusive access, negotiated access, or even preemptive access. So, for example, emergency services. They'll also have different needs. And when you listen to the three technological domain specializations, bear in mind the fact that there are differences in what they need out of spectrum. And so therefore they will contend to shape the spectrum policy environment. And they'll have different business models, different quality of service requirements, and so on. And they will already be set up to use variations on licensed, unlicensed, shared access, and other issues that are embedded in current technologies. There are also legacy physical infrastructures. And part of this means that the local wireless, at least, needs to link through into wireline or fiber networks, or maybe even power line communications. And there are a lot of issues connected with that have to do with the way we provision the built environment, the way we get permissions. So if you want to put up a wireless mast, you need permissions for that. You need permissions to connect through to the network and so on. You need other forms of permissions to provide wireless connectivity in other domains like airports and trains and metros and so on. And you need to maintain repeaters to link the local base stations together, or the handsets together with each other. Now, okay, well, I've already talked a little bit about 2.6 gigahertz. I don't want to waste too much time on this. The things that are interesting about it were, in this case, the spectrum policy mechanism was used to solve the sort of technological problem, because the 2.6 gigahertz band was supposed to be available on a technologically neutral basis. It could be used for both symmetric and unpaired technologies. So symmetric ones are designed to have as much stuff going up as down, and therefore you need two channels 120 megahertz apart so they don't interfere. The WiMAX type technologies were designed for, let's say, internet type uses where there's a lot more coming down than going up, and therefore you just use single licenses. It wasn't obvious how much of this spectrum should be devoted to which technology and which band each use should have, and how much space needed to be wasted on guard bands to manage interference. There are also differences among the bidders, because the LTE bidders were typically mobile operators who were very innovative and agile but didn't have much money. The WiMAX operators were typically national telcos and ISPs who were richer and they had a more mature technology at the time the auction was held. And so they had this complicated package proxy auction that solved that problem. It didn't work very smoothly, though, because some people who were going to make paired use of the spectrum already had licenses nearby and only needed to buy one. The other thing, only other thing I'll mention is that there was this issue about resale. If the WiMAX bidders had more money, even if they knew that their technology wasn't going to be the best one in the long run, the most sensible thing to do is to buy up all the licenses and then sell them for a lot of money afterwards. The LTE bidders might think that the WiMAX bidders couldn't make much money out of their licenses, so they'd hang back and hope to pick them up for a song in the secondary market when the WiMAX winners found out that they'd won something they couldn't use. In both cases, it distorts the number of people who participate in the auction, and that distorts the way the auction functions. And it may be that, as with the 3G licenses, the winners are left without enough money after they paid for the licenses to actually be able to make good use of them. Now, the remaining topic is the fact that we need spectrum for research collaboration, simply because if we coordinate the spectrum policy, we can facilitate research coordination and not just using that spectrum, but research development as opposed to commercial development of technologies that use wireless connectivity. And the key points here are to get these non-commercial, non-government university and research institution uses access to what may otherwise be very valuable and expensive spectrum, to integrate scientific spectrum management policies where you're, for example, doing large-scale distributed data analytics modeling with other types of spectrum management policies in adjacent spectrum, and also to be able to use spectrum policy the way that they have used internet policy around high-speed dedicated wireline infrastructures to facilitate what's called open science or shared science, like the European Open Science Cloud and its counterparts in the United States. Okay, well, that's the sort of brief, maybe not brief enough, whistle-stop tour of the general issues. So if there are questions about this or points that people want to make, we can do that and then go on to the specific technologies.
So, any questions at this point? Otherwise, oh yeah, Francisco, please.
I'm sorry, but I think that Francisco didn't unmute his microphone.
I'm sorry, I'll start again.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah. Okay. I was mentioning, I think it was you who mentioned at the beginning that there were 3 groups, expert groups, in the project. One on 5G, one on big data, one on IoT, CPS. I understand the rationale for 5G and for IoT. That's quite clear. But I don't see what is the relationship between big data and spectrum. Can someone clarify that?
Yeah, I'm planning to do that in a few minutes after. So one of the specific talks will be on big data. But just to give the 2 headline issues, the first is that big data, both in terms of the analytics and in terms of the actuators or the things driven by big data analytics, require vast flows of data processed reasonably promptly. And so the question about whether, for example, if I wanted to have a smart road of coupled automobiles, then that would mean that I would need not only to do the IoT CPS thing of linking these cars up together, but I'd have to pull the sensor data out of them, process them so that I could figure out what's happening all up and down the road, and then push it back again. So one side of it is that big data needs connectivity and managed data flows. And if we're putting them over spectrum, we need the right policy. The other side of it is that managing spectrum in this environment for 5G, for IoT, for e-health, for all these things is a ferociously complicated problem. And so there's a separate line of development, which is the use of big data to address spectrum policy issues or to help with spectrum management. So I hope that's
Okay, thanks for your clarification. A second remark I have is, at some point I think Martin mentioned that spectrum issues had changed fundamentally. Actually, I joined the commission 18 years ago, exactly, work on the spectrum policy unit. As judging from the presentation I just heard so far, I don't think these issues have changed at all. They are the same issues that had been discussed 18 years ago. So,
Well,
unless I misunderstood, I don't see any new issues there.
Well, yes, there are a couple of ways in which I feel they've changed fundamentally. First of all, itself. From an auction theory perspective, the allocation mechanisms, there are many more new and different allocation mechanisms, particularly as we move away from exclusive licenses towards shared access. And the other reason that I think things have changed is that the breadth and variety of different uses and the importance not only of the different uses, but of their particular, let's say, quality of service, latency, jitter, and things like that requirements. Those things have gotten a lot more complicated, and therefore the use of traditional allocation and management, well, just to take the Internet of Things, it used to be that type approval for equipment operating within particular spectral bands was a purely technical issue that could be solved on the basis of each individual device. Now we need to consider the interlinked operation of many different types of devices that may not adhere to common standards regarding the use of spectrum. So there have been a lot of changes. You're right to say that the policy responses have not changed that much, and it may be that these are distinctions without a difference, and that there are common ways of dealing with them. But on the surface, we've got a lot more different types of players playing a lot more different types of games in spectrum space.
Yeah, just to further that, I think in the regulated space, changes will go less fast than in the unregulated space. But technologies, in the light of what Jonathan just said, really changed the way spectrum is used as well. And
Okay,
yeah, thanks.
okay. Thanks for the clarification. That's I understand. That's clear now. And
Okay,
just one final remark. Just one final remark, which is not a question, concerning the European Open Science Cloud. I mentioned that my first job with the Commission was Spectrum. My last job was on cloud computing and the preparation for the European Open Science Cloud. And again, on that, I don't really see what is the relationship with this spectrum policy. Perhaps I'm wrong.
So, yeah, just to confess a special interest, Martin and I just concluded a piece of work on governance of the Open Science Cloud. And as part of that, we looked at parallel types of initiative that were being pursued in different member states and in other parts of the world, at other than a European level. And some of these involved the creation, the virtual creation of large-scale data access and computing facilities for scientific purposes that were not linked by physical infrastructures. So it's not to say that the EOSC is necessarily wireless, but it is to say that the costs, and in particular the ways in which it will be provisioned, may depend on the existence of wireless means of connectivity. Particularly, yeah. So it's just that that's an example of a collaborative scientific endeavor, which at least in some instances is running wirelessly and will probably run wirelessly in the future, particularly if it starts using, let's say, sensor nets or actuator nets to do the things that the scientists wish to do with it. So it's not all going to be, what would you call it? I guess they call it big science or e-science, the sort of Spence and Paul David type of things.
Okay, thanks very much. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. For the sake of time, I think it's important we move on to also cover the 5G aspects and the big data specific aspects and the IoT. So I suggest we go to Janning. Janning, floor is yours.
Okay. Hello?
Hello, we could hear you.
Yes. Okay, great. So, hello, I'm Yanin. I'm currently briefly discuss topic.
Sorry, Yang, I can hear you so low. And
Wait.
far.
It's better now?
Yes, it is.
Okay,
Definitely.
put my microphone bit just right in front of my mouth. Okay, so today talk about briefly discuss about the topic that is relevant to research and innovation collaboration between EU and the US on spectral respect to 5G network. So in generally, the wireless spectrum is the most important resource for wireless communication. And in the previous generations of wireless communication from 2G to 4G, the main focus was to provide higher capacity and data rates. In the era of 5G, such a paradigm has changed. We are not just looking for higher data rates, but also other applications or use cases like massive machine type communication or ultra reliable low latency communications. So in principle, to satisfy, in general, we have a limited spectral resource, and also considering the fact that the coverage of one wireless communication system is inverse proportional to the carrier frequency. So we must think differently to how to allocate different spectrum for different use cases. For example, for extended mobile broadband, we might want to look into the probability of a higher band higher than 6 gigahertz into millimeter wave. And for IoT type or machine type of communication, where the coverage is most important, then we will think about less than 1 gigahertz. And for the ultra reliable low latency communication, we would think maybe 1 to 6 gigahertz compromise regarding to coverage and data rates. But of course, this is just a theoretic, theoretic understanding. But in practice, it might be very complicated. There's so many bands. Spectral have allocated in previous generations and also other services. So, but we see there's a significant potential for the coexistence of 5G with other wireless service and for the, high frequency above 24 gigahertz. Slide, please. Only.
Naninga cannot hear you anymore.
Please
yes.
speak very carefully in the microphone because
Okay.
sometimes we hear you better than other times. And you're still on slide 1, right?
Yes, I want to change the next slide.
Thank you.
Okay, so so is it better now? Sorry, my microphone is not working very well. So when we talk about the spectrum management model, so there's of course the traditional licensed and unlicensed spectrum. Of course, recently there has a new development on this licensed assisted access, that is using the carrier aggregation to bring both licensed and unlicensed spectrum together. But in the 5G, there's a new paradigm that is emerging, that is called the shared spectrum, that is about the dynamic spectral access, where US has already assigned about 3.5 giga or 3.6 gigahertz for this citizens broadband radio service. And on the other hand, the EU is considering this another called license shared access or connective use of spectrum. But in general, I understand that there's different approaches between EU and the US, where US focuses and in general prefer unlicensed spectrum or shared spectrum, while in EU we are more looking at the licensed spectrum as tradition. But in any case, it is very important to allocate this kind of a technology neutral spectral license that can enable the existing mobile technology to be easily reframed for 5G, so that we can make spectrum more efficient. And then we consider, in terms of 5G, we also have to consider the fact of spectral harmonization. There's a certain motivation to do that. Of course, first is about to ease this global roaming, so that you don't need to have a different frequency for accessing different country. It's not necessary your mobile phone can be used in another country. It's not that's a good thing. Another thing is that if certain band can be used in the globally, so most likely we will have a large number of equipment, so which means that it's easier to have a low-cost device. So that due to this scale economics, also this can help to avoid interferences between neighboring countries. And of course, it also will make the spectral licensing much more valuable. But this requires lots of collaboration and alignment between governments, among governments and regulators, in national, regional, like in Europe, in North America, or Pacific Asia, or at international levels like ITU. So in this sense, the World Radio Conference in 2019 will be extremely important, where the new mobile spectrums will be assigned, especially in high band. As we understand, at the moment, the priority of Europe is around 26 gigahertz. That is adjacent to the US 28 gigahertz, and about 42 gigahertz adjacent to the US 39 gigahertz band, and also 66 to 71 gigahertz. That is considered part as a license-free use, basically unlicensed use. So basically, there's still quite a big difference, or even you can say a bit competitive or strategy difference between EU-US in terms of what are the priority band in millimeter wave. So in general, this is quite it's like the different spectral management models preferred in EU and the US, and the preferred band. So there's such a difference. It's in general quite challenging to come up to do very concrete research on which band to choose, a very concrete which to choose. But on the other hand, we could also look into the possibility of to do this kind of general research for bring the fundamental issues about challenge, as Martin mentioned before. What kind of challenges that are facing by EU-US together? For example, what kind of spectral access should be used? What kind of methods? And most importantly, how this should be relevant to vertical industries? And also, what are the scopes for licensed and rule-based spectrum use controls? There's lots of possibilities. What like exclusive license and license shared use? We have a list, very long list in the policy paper. You can find more details there. But of course, until we talk about the spectral access or a scope of the different management model, it's a more abstract level still. In order to enable them, we need to build enablers for this kind of innovative agile spectral access. So technically, we can together UNUs to identify what are the major technical components. What are the research challenges and opportunities in terms of, for example, what kind of device do you need? What kind of cognitive radio, device, or what is feasible, what is not feasible, and those things should be clarified. On the other hand, from policy point of view, how to link those technical aspects to spectral policy, so that we can make the 5G deployment or rollout going smoothly, when especially we consider there's so many different services and so many different verticals and different actors like traditional mobile network operators and some new entrants and vertical industries. So there's many things can be done together in that sense. And also, of course, the traditional coexistence study that is very important for any spectral policy. And of course, possibly there's a different preference on specific bands, but the general method should be applied in any band. For example, in higher frequency, we talk about the coexistence with fixed links and satellite services. There's some coexistence study can be done there. Also, for example, to analyze what kind of policy should we have for spectral use conditions and the pricing in the 5G, like how long, how many years, what kind of duration, license duration we should give, or should we give in a national level or sub-national level? And should we bound the license with different conditions? For example, to mandate levels of current coverage and sharing mechanisms. And so basically find a good balance between free market and, on the other hand, to provide a guaranteed service. As mentioned before, there's a big difference of 5G than the traditional or previous generations is we will involve a lot of different use cases and different verticals. And also another thing is that to involve this higher band millimeter wave. So this creates mixed match a lot of new possibilities. For example, it's sensible to provide the coverage to fixed and mobile service and higher bands. Or should the vertical seek a localized license or local shared access? Also, should this be operated by operator, mobile operator? Will this neutral? We have this kind of neutral host for the small cell providers that they become a service provider for the local users. And also talk about, actually from technical point of view, they have discussed a lot about dual use of spectrum for access and backhaul. So this should be also addressed or agreed from the policy point of view. And so in general, this is a very complicated it's not an easy issue to address, say, which is better, which is not. For example, when we talk about 26 gigahertz, you see, for different type of spectral use, we will have different question needs to be addressed. For example, for exclusive use, so again, how long should we provide such a license? And should some industry be excluded in the bidding phase? And for this license shared access, so what kind of mechanism can help that to enable the use of the existing spectrum, like satellite, fixed line, that with 5G? So there's a lot of issues needs to be addressed, and especially in the next few years when the 5G graduate roll out, and also the more and more involvement of industry in the verticals, and if they want to build a business over 5G, there's lots of issues that have to be addressed by the policy point of view. So, and any question?
Yes, thank you very much, Janine. I don't hear you anymore, but you made the point very clear on the changes that are coming in and still ongoing in the 5G network developments that is still going on. For the sake of time, I'd like to immediately go on to Jonathan to talk more about the big data aspects. And after that, to Christian to specific IoT aspects as well. Before we go over for a final question round, you can always type in. Francisco might be typing right now, and we'll take them along while we speak. But our ultimate hour is 15 minutes from now, so hence this choice at this point. Jonathan.
Okay, yes, I'll be very quick. I've already said much of what I was going to say. There are two directions in which big data comes into it. It's much less directly implicated than the other two technology domains. First is the use of spectrum as an infrastructure to support big data and let's call it artificial general intelligence or machine learning types of applications, and the applications of big data to spectrum management. As regards to the first, as big data enabled services and AI type services expand, their communication requirements will grow as well. And the issues that need to be dealt with are the scaling up of these things, handling velocity, volume, variability, and so on, the particular characteristics of big data related traffic. The fact that many of these data uses, in particular, for example, the use of big data to run parts of complex interacting systems, have pretty tight limits on the speed with which they need to respond. And it's not only the case that you need to provision the time urgent ones and give them some priority, but if the ranking of the speeds of response of some of the data flows gets out of whack, the system as a whole will begin to topple over because it is a complex system, which is what might be considered the data latency spectrum. The reason why that's problematic is that the priority given to one use will therefore depend on the uses, on what other uses are making of the communications that's available to them. And finally, to the extent that wirelessness means mobile communications, there are other restrictions that reflect the nature of the data or the nature of the decisions that are being made and actuated through these networks, and in particular, privacy and security. The flip side of this is the use of big data for spectrum management. And in this case, this is similar to what happens with analytics in other network contexts. Networks are much more complicated than simply counting the number of entities that are in them. they expand at least exponentially as 2 to the n, and maybe even, as n squared, and maybe even as 2 to the n. And in particular, when we're trying to manage the behavior of these systems, we're moving away from the simple kind of predict and provide sorts of strategies to things that are much more active and interactive, where we moderate both the supply and the demand across these big data applications. And so this is similar to the requirements that are coming from the spectrum requirements are similar to those that are coming from other network contexts. The range of issues includes the sort of tools that are used right now for data visualization, technical calculations, control monitoring systems and devices, and also the implementation of flexible and sort of open forms of sensing and control. So for instance, if we have unstructured data like crowd data or transport data, you can't simply match it to existing patterns, in part because of herding and cascades and other types of exotic things. You need to be able to pick them up from these unstructured data. That requires machine learning. The machine learning may make decisions that are critical and therefore need to be controlled. And if they're happening too fast or are too complex, then the wireless resources required to exercise that control may be pretty ferocious. Moreover, in these systems that are evolving, it's not simply a matter of managing the system as it stands, but of continually learning about its evolving behavior, which may mean sort of consciously conducting experiments on the people who are using these trading or traffic systems, because the management parts of it and the use and provisioning parts of it will all be responding to each other, and that too is a big data type of task. And big data can help at all kinds of levels, both in the static allocation mechanisms, which is to say allocating licenses or rights to use particular things in a particular area, which may be very, very complicated. In helping human decision makers to make their decisions by providing them with useful and relevant data at the time they're needed, and to enable and facilitate automated parts of the system like automated spectrum management or dynamic spectrum access, as Yaning talked about. Okay, that's it for that.
Okay, so maybe Christian could, or maybe you have any question before going. No, sorry, I wanted to leave the word to Christian.
Okay, thank you very much. So first of all, thank you very much for all the detailed information about spectrum issues. I only have a very few slides because this is not really my topic, and all of the slides are based on the excellent draft policy paper by Jonathan, who he has already talked about quite a bit. Can I? Oh, down here, 1 second. Okay, so just to give some context, so in our IoT CPS group, we don't really focus on the connectivity itself. So because the area is so huge, we've decided to focus more on the question, if we have sensors and actuators, how can we actually close the loop between them, not caring too much about the connectivity that drives them. But obviously everything we've heard so far is highly relevant for both the IoT and also future CPS systems. So these are the systems that we are looking at. So I think almost everything that we've heard so far is relevant also for our area. So what Jonathan and Martin have elaborated in the paper is obviously many millions of devices will be connected to the IoT, especially in the area of machine-to-machine communication. And all of these must be connected somehow, including the sensors and actuators that are so relevant for our work. And many of these are going to be very remote. It's going to be very expensive to retrofit existing infrastructures with cable-based or land-based communications. And there is often the need for some mobility, for example, in autonomous cars. So many of these connections will be wireless, and spectrum management will obviously be crucial for the systems that we are looking at, which we call IoT-enabled cyber-physical systems. So these are technical systems that are based on connectivity provided by the Internet of Things. And just some challenges that are taken directly from the paper. So for many of these real-time applications that we're looking at, there are some requirements that need to be fulfilled. For example, by 5G connections or other wireless connections. One example is communication ubiquity. Then reliability and quality of service is a very big concern when you're talking about real-time IoT-based CPS systems, but also criticality of communication prioritization. Then if you look at specific applications, for example, smart cities, or smart production systems, smart farming systems, they all have different use case specific needs that must be taken into account. And a final point, which we all have also stumbled across in our work, is that if you have a large technical IoT-enabled cyber-physical system, you're going to have lots of different parties involved, and there are going to be ownership issues that arise. And in this case, obviously, this will relate to the electromagnetic spectrum, and there's going to be policy collaboration needed to resolve these issues. So sorry, my talk was very brief, but I think it's not really my topic, but you've made some excellent points before. Thank you very much.
Okay, so maybe there are a few questions that you want to do on the specific items of 5G and big data and IoT CPS from Alvaro or Gordon or Wim. I can see that there is a question. Radio seems to cut out a bit. I'll try to let you talk, Wim. In the case, you should see the microphone icon. Okay, sorry. Okay, sorry. Okay, so maybe Jonathan has also other issue that raised up after Christian and Yanning presentations.
Well, I mean, I recognize everything that they added. I think what it illustrates in particular to me is the specific differences between these domains. I mean, none of these domains are really distinct from each other, right? They all overlap to some degree. So, for example, in the IoT, well, 5G, the 5G applications and the 5G uses will generate vast amounts of data and have quite strict requirements, quite strict performance requirements. And therefore, the use of a common spectrum with other systems may create, for instance, contention problems, or let's say contrasting or conflicting quality of service requirements. And so unless we have all of these technologies owned by a single entity that can endogenize these sort of external or interfering effects, there will be something difficult there for policy to deal with. And I expect that we will see entities emerge. I'm an economist, so I worry about these things. Verticals that are also quite horizontal in covering a lot of these things, and there'll be an advantage from managing these things in-house. So, for example, integrating their big data use and their IoT systems, or their parts of the IoT systems, with the use of 5G types of spectral application, particularly if they can control the standards. So part of the role of policy here might be to actually prevent the strategic players here from getting too much of a lock on the other domains by creating and imposing standards that may be more appropriate to their domain or may not reflect the full set of perspectives. So one part is the perspectives, because none of the tech players really represent the entire value chain, but they represent them indirectly as customers or suppliers or as regulators who make their lives hard. But they also have different abilities to change their technologies in ways that make spectrum problems easier to deal with. A simple example of this is agile communications. If instead of having 2 things or 20 things that need to talk to each other simultaneously locked to the same frequencies, there are ways in which they can hop about the frequency domain, then they become much better neighbors for all other uses of those frequencies. And so there are things that can be technologically enabled that can make the policy problem a little bit easier. And that certainly applies to other aspects like data security or the need to maintain integrity for critical services. So I think the spectrum area, because we're all using the same resource, you can have special privacy policies. You can have special security policies. It's much harder to have special policies for commons like the electromagnetic spectrum. And so in a certain sense, this policy problem is, even though it's more indirect and isn't really directly considered, mostly the 5G people have paid a lot of direct attention to it, but it is one of the more wicked areas and one of the areas where the integration across the tech domains is most visible. So that was the thought that I had after listening to them. Don't know if it's useful.
So thank you, Jonathan. I don't know also if there are any possible comments on this from Christian or Yannick. I saw that Martin is now offline. I can see that Yannick is with her mic that is on.
Yes, I just, can you hear me? I seem to have an audio problem. That's the problem here. And so after listening to what Jonathan said, I think it can possibly to be put in another way. Nowadays, the technology world changes so much, and it's going to definitely going to the direction of convergence. So it's not about in the past. For 5G or 4G is wireless, it's only about wireless. It's not anymore. Everything actually discussed today, big data, IoT, CPS, everything is connected. Everything will converge. So maybe the message what Jonathan wants to say is also that while the technique outside the world is converging, possibly from policymaker point of view, this should also have kind of converging the spectral policy. That's too, so that we can finally meet to have a very efficient, let's say, efficient way of dealing the spectral and make sure it will create the, create the good effect as it's supposed to be. Yes, that's what I say. Yeah, that's all.
Yeah, I agree. I think there are several. One thing that tells me is that maybe, and this is something we said in the conclusions, that maybe spectrum policy, maybe we don't need a lot of these stovepipes. And so what we said in the conclusions was only that spectrum policy needs to involve a lot of other perspectives and players as they converge onto the wireless spectrum. But it also follows, I mean, the least thing that follows is that the distinction between spectrum or spectrum as a perspective on wireless communication and other parts of ways of regulating wireless communication, like content regulation and so on, and between wireless and wired communication, that a lot of these things, by treating them separately, we actually distort development and discourage convergence or force kind of the wrong kind of convergence. The even better thing might be if the connectivity part of it, the communication part of it, the network part of it, became more or less invisible, right? So if you have good spectrum management, then good spectrum management is spectrum management that you don't notice, right? I mean, our internet connections, to have this conversation, become visible when they don't work, and we've got to do things to make them work again. if we could just talk the way we could when we were in the same room, in other words, if the policy worked properly, it would be, the policy domain would be invisible. And that would allow us to get on to things that sort of really matter, although these things are really technically very interesting. So I think that, you know, whenever there's convergence, if we have convergence with hardware devices, for example, we have lots and lots of converged devices. And that's the failure of them, that we have lots of them. I have a laptop and a television and a car and a mobile phone, all of which do basically the same things. I don't have one device. I've got a whole bunch of them. They're not all equally good, and so they are visible. They get in between me and what I'm doing. So you can imagine a convergence, but a convergence can also go too far. We could have, for example, privacy protocols and assumptions and policies that fit, let's say, for a wireline domain, when it's much harder to listen in and harder to interfere than it would be for a wireless domain. And so it may be that certain things, like conducting surgical operations wirelessly, for example, or controlling self-driving cars, have requirements that maybe what we don't want is a single set of protocols and management processes that serve all needs, but rather a kind of common floor, and then certain special things, so that the fragmentation matches the specific requirements of it, and isn't just fragmentation that's there to protect somebody's commercial domain. So I think that the convergence point's a very good one as far as converging onto spectrum, as far as considering connectivity, as far as considering joined up policy, but it probably goes farther by saying if we have the right kind of convergence, then we don't have to converge in the wrong kinds of places. So yeah, thanks. It's a really nice idea. Yeah.
Okay, so I think that we are kind of arriving at the latest part of the webinar, which is actually closed, but the main point that I wanted to raise up is that actually Martin, Jonathan, as well as all the chair and co-chair of the expert groups in PICASSO are going to refine the outline policy brief regarding spectrum issues. So will personally send to you the document, and if you have comments, of course Jonathan and Martin are going to be glad to have them. And I would like also to introduce you our PICASSO tool, the Crossroads, where you will find any kind of information related to access opportunities on EU-US ICT collaboration, but also regarding other different resources that we have submitted within the specific items in 5G, IoT, CPS, and big data, all related to policy issues. This is the fourth webinar. We had outlined policy briefing, data protection, standardization, and I don't remember another one, but I'm sorry right now. And actually, thank you. As I told you, I will send all the recordings that will be also available in the case you would like to share the discussion, the briefing note, and the PPT. So thank you all.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks.
And thank you to Alvaro. Okay, that is going to provide the comments from Human Smart Cities domain.
Okay, great. Yes, thanks, Alvaro.
Thank you, Gordon and Wim.
Yep.
Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.
So much. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.